Hi, everyone. This is Megan Sweet. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. As always, I'm with my lovely co-host.
Hi, I'm Susan Andrian.
And today we have Lauren Keck with us, who's going to talk with us about conscious parenting. Lauren, I'm really excited to have you here. Maybe can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Yes. I am Lauren Colonnese Keck, and I'm a former high school English teacher turned conscious parenting coach. And I am also really interested in the idea of conscious education as well. And in my parenting work, we kind of talk about the overlap and parents as the children's first teachers and the education that they receive in the home, and then also the schools or other forms of education that children experience outside, which I have a background in. I also taught at a Montessori school for a year. So I have
Montessori.
Yes.
Nice. That is not your, I wanted to go back to your, I'm not calling you out, Lauren. I just loved your bio. So I'm going to read the bio that you shared because it was so magical. So I'm going to read this bio as well, Lauren.
Yes.
So Lauren Colonnese, is that right?
Colonnese is how we say
Colonnese.
But I am not particular.
Is that Italian?
It's Italian, yeah. Well, and that's not even the correct Italian pronunciation either. My family says it incorrectly. Colonnese, yeah.
Colonnese.
If we were saying it correctly.
In a former life, I was married to someone who was Italian, and it was Maloney, which we also said wrong, but it was spelled in a way that it looks like Mellone, so it looks like Malone. So I'm with you. Anyway, Lauren Colonnese Keck is a wisdom student, a share of what she's learning, mystic, ever-evolving daughter of life and the stars, storyteller, conscious parenting coach, healer, wife, mother, dog mom, avid chocolate chip cookie baker and eater, playful painter, and yoga and poetry enthusiast seeking to participate in the emergence of new ways of being and loving. Lauren.
I'm going to have to memorize that.
That is so fun.
Back on.
I need to memorize that one so I can say that one when people, I wrote it, but I did not memorize it.
That's so, I want to talk about the conscious parenting, but I would love to hear, I resonate a lot with what you shared there. And I love that that's what you're bringing forward. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those attributes and what led you to write that in your bio as well.
Yeah, I'm really passionate right now about being a lifelong learner who learns out loud. I named myself, I think I named myself wisdom student, right? Not wisdom teacher, right? In my bio, if I'm remembering right what you just said. So wisdom student, learner, enthusiast, appreciator of things. I love chocolate chip cookies. And
Me too.
It's so important to me to self-identify as a seeker on this journey, not someone who's arrived, who's showing other people the way. I'm learning as I go, and I'm doing it out loud. And my coaching clients currently, and other people that I've interacted with in other ways, suggest to me with their feedback that they benefit from witnessing me learning out loud, and they take what they want and they leave what they don't. And I'm not telling anyone what to do. And that's very different than my traditional school background and my first career as a traditional high school English teacher, in which I was told what to do and told to tell students what to do. And that is not how I do life anymore. So,
well, this is why I wanted to pull that out, Lauren, and I appreciate you sharing that. That's why the Awakening Educator is called the Awakening Educator, for that exact same reason, which is just an acknowledgement that we're always learning and growing. And Susan and I are fairly transparent that we're learning all the time. Some of it's just how to do this show. Sometimes it's about other things. But that actually breaking away from that notion that we as educators have to know everything and have to be like these fountains of knowledge and have to be perfect. I talk about it a lot in my book as well, that actually just sets us up for a lot of failure and struggle. because we're always learning and growing, and there shouldn't be any shame in that. There should be a lot of joy in that, and a lot of just exploration. But we put so much pressure on educators to know everything and be everything that I think it makes it really hard to make mistakes. It makes it really hard to learn. It makes it really hard to be human in one of the most human-centered environments that there can be, which is a classroom or a school. Like, you are just swimming in people there. And everybody's having their own experience. And to not normalize that that's happening for educators as well, I think is such a shame. So I really appreciate, that's why I wanted to pull it forward. So thank you.
There's also a theme that I think's been coming up in a lot of our shows lately around this idea of this. We go into education. Many of us go into education because our love and passion for education, our love and passion for kids, and that the system is not set up to support that, right? Like, as you said, there's all of these layers in which you're supposed to show up as the expert, and there's so many constraints over what we know is good for kids. And I appreciate you highlighting that piece and sort of thinking about, as I continue to be in education, constantly wrestling with this idea of how do I show up for kids and families in a way that I know is right and creates environments for learning within the structures and the systems that exist, and where that challenge is, and that miss in harmony. It's not in harmony a lot of times, right? And that theme's been showing up a lot for us, and I'm curious what your journey was from there to here. What did you have to do to kind of make that leap, and what were some of the constraints that led for you to make that decision to leave education to pursue this other form of education or learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started out as a high school English teacher. I earned a master's in education, and I was taught that I was supposed to, teach the students what I was given to teach them. And I was trained in a program that had its positives and negatives. My master's in education program taught the constructivist learning model, which I favor over the traditionalist model. So the traditionalist model says the adults, the teachers, the whomever are the experts. They know what you need to know, and children are like empty receptacles that we put that information in. That would be a, oversimplification of the traditionalist model of education. The constructivist model says children are meaning makers. They are constructing their knowledge as they interact with their environment and their experiences all the time. So in order to meaningfully teach human children, we first have to know who they are and where they are, to know what they could possibly build on what they already have, what could be constructed on what they already have. And so I was trained in that. And then I taught in a traditional high school where I was given a curriculum, I was given books, I was told to submit all my lesson plans before, for approval before the year began. I had to design activities and assignments and assessments for people I had never met.
Right.
I didn't know them. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know what they needed. And year after year, I would learn and adapt throughout the year. And then I would go, next year, I'm going to get it right from the beginning. This summer, I'm revamping everything. I was never a teacher who repeated anything from year to year. Every summer, I was like, well, that wasn't quite it. So let me redo everything within the constraints and confines of the curriculum I was handed and the books I was required to teach and all of that. So, but I was like, revamp everything. And then I would get a new group of students, and then they would be different humans. And eventually it was just too exhausting and frustrating and disappointing for me to authentically and in a live way continue. So then I discovered Montessori education, and I thought that was going to be my answer. And I temporarily became kind of like a Montessori zealot. And the Montessori pedagogical program or theory does try to create an environment in which the students come in and they get to be individuals to a degree. They come in and they're assessed to be where they are. And the Montessori method is designed to try to meet each child where they are and offer them options that they can build on where they are. So that was better. It was definitely better. And I still was experiencing this top down, you still have to meet these requirements. You still have to do such and such by this deadline. You still have to, you still have to, you still have to. And I remember just feeling exhausted by this have to energy that I felt like was coming on to me and then I was putting on to my students. And so when I walked away from that, well, and I also spent 8 years as an adjunct professor for a community college as well, teaching writing composition for a college. And same thing. You have to, they have to, I have to, they have to. And so what I was really searching for was a bottom up, what is true and authentic for me? And what is a match for that? And that is what I advocate for with my parenting clients who, they're struggling with their children. Because one of the things that I find to be pretty consistent about parenting, and this was true for me as well, is I had preconceived ideas of who and what my children would be before they were born. And then even after they were born, I was like, you're my child. You're going to be this way like me, or you're going to be that way like me, or what? Who's he? Whatty? You're doing that? That doesn't match my expectations.
Yep.
Yeah. And then the different options for how to react to that are, I will point you in this direction so you can conform to my expectations, or I will readjust my expectations and go, wow, who are you? Show me who you are. And how can we together take each other into consideration and, navigate whatever struggles we're having. So that's what I try to teach parents. And that's what I advocate for in education as well. I was talking to an innovative educator recently who is pioneering a micro middle school in Colorado in which classes only have 10 students and the students help run a bike shop and a coffee shop. And they get to know these individual students as people, and then they co-create curriculums and assignments and, things for them to grow. Is this a
private school or a public school or charter school? How is the school funded, Tina?
That is a great question, and I didn't ask that question. It's called Embark, and it's in Denver, Colorado, and I don't know the answer to your question.
Well, I think what you're bringing up, and I felt that frustration too, Lauren, and when I was a teacher so I taught English and social studies in middle school, so I taught the core, but I was a social studies teacher by training, and by passion more. But, to teach social studies in middle school, I was supposed to cover in 1 year something like 2,000 years of, human evolution.
In a meaningful way.
And it was, I remember, and I gave it my best shot. I created my own system for doing that. But what was really interesting when I was collaborating with one of my peers, and this broke my heart, and I don't falter for it, but it broke my heart. This was when standards were fairly new, because I'm an old woman now. But standards were fairly new, and she went in and she counted how many different she went into our state test, which she's not supposed to do anyway, but this is what she did. She went to the state test and she counted how many questions were related to the different parts, the different regions we were studying and teaching in history. And then she adjusted her content that she was teaching the next year to mirror that.
What?
So yeah, so I understand, there's a lot of pressure to have strong test scores, everything else. So of course, Eurocentric approach that Europe, and this was world history. So Europe had 50% of the questions. So she spent 50% of her time on Europe. Japan had 2 questions. So she decided to spend 2 weeks on Japan. And this kind of perpetuates a lot of the challenges we have in this country, because whatever gets tested gets focused upon. And we have a big problem with Eurocentric white culture being the prevalent voice, within our culture. And she was doing that in her classroom because she was feeling the pressure to make sure the kids did well on the test. Now, I was the other end of the spectrum. I didn't care. So I was like, whatever. We're going to learn these things and we're going to have fun and we're going to explore each country evenly. But, probably on paper, I was the worst teacher because of that, because we just looked at things differently. And I left teaching short. That was actually my last full year teaching when that happened. And ever since then, I've been an administrator, and I also work at this advocacy level. And I think there's this need for the innovation that you're describing in these schools that can actually meet kids exactly where they are. Because for some kids, that's what they need. They need a micro school that can provide them that support. Other ones actually thrive in a large, comprehensive school, and that's what they need. But our system is so rigid now that it becomes this top-down thing that you're describing, from like state to county to district to school. You're going to have to follow these. So the intention is to create equity and continuity of learning. But I think the outcome is that it kind of squishes teacher innovation and teachers' ability to really be adaptable to kids. And it squishes kid learning. And I happen to have a student who doesn't learn in a traditional way. And so he struggles a lot in school because it's hard for him to connect and make meaning. But he doesn't have any schools, unless I was to go private, but I'm a public school believer. He doesn't have any public schools that can meet him there where he is. And that's just hard,
Yeah. And I would say, I have two, and one is in a traditional comprehensive high school, and the other is in a smaller arts charter school. And my son would not do well in that comprehensive high school at all. But I'm also extremely, and have to be, thoughtful about how we talk. But I've been very disappointed in her experience. And although she can thrive there, and socially, it's where she needs to be, because that's what she's all about, is social.
That's what her engine is for sure.
Her engine is for sure social. But I also feel like there's a miss or a loss because it's impossible in a comprehensive high school when you have 40 kids in an individual class, and that you see that many kids coming in and out. And she's been there for 2 years. A year and a half of it has been on home distance learning. So the experience of being able to connect the social aspect of it with, like, what does it mean to be interested in what you're learning, to be engaged in a learning as a learner. And so I wonder for educators, because Megan and I haven't fallen with let's abandon it yet. We understand that thought, right? We can empathize with those that have decided I can no longer live within this system. I've just chosen to leave and support that. And we've decided to continue to work within the system to some degree to try and shift things within the system. And wondering, what are the lessons from conscious parenting, from having moved outside of the system? And I'd say neither one of us are totally in it. We're also in roles that are sort of very different. And Megan's now independent. And she's an independent consultant, but I'm still within the district, but in a non-traditional role. So I guess we're hoping, and I think we may be up on our first. Are you watching the time, Megan? Are we up on our first?
Let's ask your question, then we'll re-ask it, but we'll give Lauren a chance to think about it over break, because you're right, we're already there.
So we're at our first break, but maybe when we come back, what we'd like to talk about is thinking about what wisdom do you have from now having left the system, looking back in, that may support teachers, educators, or parents to advocate for the education that they feel like their children deserve. Because I think it's important for us to continue to invest in public education and to advocate for what we know is good for kids. Because I think that if we either give up or all leave, that we're losing this really important pillar of what makes
our society.
Yeah, our society. So
yeah.
All right, so
cool.
Go on break. I'm just gonna. Oops.
And we're back.
And we're back.
We just changed order. Lauren and I switched places. So now I'm in the middle.
Because I was backstage for a moment. It said, you're backstage and you'll be back on in a minute. And here we are in a different order.
Here we are in a different. I'm the middle child, so this feels most comfortable for me anyway, actually.
That's good.
You.
So I'm going to bring us back in. And so for the edit. Welcome back to the Awakening Educator. I'm Susan Andrian.
I'm Megan Sweet.
And today we have Lauren Colonize Keck. I said it right. Who has left education to do conscious parenting coaching. And before we went out on break, we were talking with Lauren about what she has learned now, having left public education to work with parents and to work from outside of the system. What kind of wisdom, as a lifelong wisdom seeker, do you have for those of our listeners and our audience and those of us still within the system, lessons that we might be able to bring to advocate for our students from within?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And I kind of want to highlight multiple things. One of the things I want to highlight was Megan saying earlier, on paper, I was probably the worst teacher. But, and I'm going to paraphrase you now, I know I was doing what was authentically best for myself and my students, while I would have been evaluated by the tests, by the standards, by the criteria that someone who never spent a moment in my classroom decided I and my students would be evaluated by. And so when I heard you describe yourself that way, well, on paper, I was probably the worst teacher. And in other ways, you were the best teacher for yourself and your students, the children that were actually in front of you.
Right.
So one thing I was a rebellious high school English teacher. I was, kind of the stereotypical, I feel like in the movies, it's always the English teacher, And so, and I could see why. You can't love literature and read all those stories and not learn to challenge the status quo, to challenge authority, the best stories that we taught were about that. And why do we challenge it? The ability to challenge it paradoxically embodies the value of having it. And so if we can't challenge it, if we're just going to accept things as they are and maintain the status quo, we're not learning, we're not growing, we're not doing what we set out to do. One of my favorite authors on the topics of both parenting and education is Alfie Kohn. And he's written, okay, great. So he's written so many books, and his life's work, in his own words, in a recent conversation I had with him, what is to call people out for what they say they're doing and what they're actually doing. So if our public school system did what the advertisements that are trying to draw parents to choose their local public school over alternatives, if that school was actually doing what they claim they were doing, we wouldn't have the problems that we have. But they're not, and they're not aware of it. And I can say that now because I have done work to become conscious of what I was unconscious of. So my conscious parenting coaching training program helped me see what I was saying I wanted to do for my children and what I was actually doing for my children and where that didn't line up. And if I realign with my true goals and I acknowledge how to actually achieve those goals, because teaching to the test, that doesn't create critical thinkers, lifelong learners. That doesn't create what we're supposedly trying to create, what our highest ideals are. It doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure. Like, none of these things are doing what they say they do. So like you said, I left. And I see the value. So I feel like we have multiple choices, and I don't think there's a right choice. And, when I mentioned that awesome micro school earlier, I don't think that should be replicated or copied. I don't think it's like, oh, this is a cool idea. If we just had, micro schools for everyone, absolutely not. And I have two children, like you were both naming. My children have different needs, different personalities, extroverts, introverts. A micro school is not for everyone, but it's for some people. And, having enough options and enough variety so people can find what's a match for them, because that gives them the best chance of actually building meaningful knowledge in a meaningful way that meets them where they are and challenges them to grow. That's what I would want. That's what I want to see in education.
There's a couple things I want to pick up on that. And one, when you started with English teachers, my mother-in-law has been a 50-year English teacher at community college, and my husband is a writer. And the activism that is my mother-in-law lives and dies by and has her whole career. So when you were describing that, I felt like I needed to uplift who she is and who she has been in the world, because you described her perfectly.
Yeah.
And she created this pretty passionate writer.
Pretty passionate.
All right. Extremely passionate.
On a scale of 1 to 10 and 11.
Yeah, exactly. And so,
Maybe 12.
So much of what you said there is like really resonated for me, and I think and many of the folks in my life. So I just wanted to highlight that piece of it. It looked like Megan had an actual question. I just needed to reflect on that piece.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said something that, of course, caught my attention because of a lot of the writing that I do, which is around this awakening consciousness. And so I was a little bit curious what you were saying. I know you're talking about parenting, but we're still talking about school. So I'm aware that we have not really even talked about conscious parenting.
Yeah, well, there's overlap.
So, apologies.
There's enough overlap there.
Especially this year, there was a huge overlap.
Parents as teachers, right. But something you said, it's true for parents too. It's something that I write about a lot. And it's maybe I heard it wrong because I just wanted to hear it my way. So let me check it. But I have this notion that for us to really be the most embodied and impactful educators, we need to develop a much greater sense of self-awareness and to work on ourselves. So you said become conscious, and that's what I heard there. I do this frame that I call the 3 I's, which is basically like have emotional intelligence, dedicate yourself to that, work with yourself, not just in like I'm a bad person, but like know yourself, work on the things that are blind spots, but be aware of what the blind spots are and have that be actually a fundamental part of what it is your job to do as an educator, not just an extra nice thing, but like as a way of teaching or as a way of being an educator, having that awareness be there. Is that what you were meaning by that? Or did I just listen into it because that's what I wanted to hear?
No, I like what you wanted to hear. Yeah, that resonates. That resonates for me because in parenting and educating and interacting with any human, I mean, we could bring in partnering and all kinds of other things. When you're interacting with anyone, if you don't see yourself clearly, if you don't know yourself, you can't see the other person clearly. You can't know them. You can't engage with them in an open awareness way where you're like, okay, so for example, when I did my teacher training, they had us take tests to see what kind of learners we were, what our preferences were. I was a high audio learner. Like there was like the sliding scale, like audio, whatever, visual, whatever was on the other side. And it was like 1 to 12. I was like 12, like audio. And it's fascinating to me too, because these tests are so limited. That doesn't mean that I don't learn visually. I actually very much enjoy visual learning as well. But if you give me a set of multiple choice questions, my answers correlate with preference for audio, like higher. I love words. I love language. That's why I was an English teacher. So we were trained to get to know ourselves and our preferences so that we didn't unconsciously project them onto all of our students. Because if teachers aren't helped to become aware of their own preferences, if they're unconscious of them, they exist, but they're not conscious of them, the most likely thing that happens is they unconsciously assume everyone has their preferences and they teach the way that's best for them. And that's really helpful when you have to create all your lesson plans before you've ever even met your students. So, then you can just teach in your preferred way, and it works for the small percentage of kids that happen to match your preferences. And the rest of the kids are varying degrees removed from what's actually best for them. So to be a most optimal, effective educator, you need to know yourself, see yourself clearly, and then put in the effort to get to know and see clearly every one of your students. Right. And if you have 40 kids in a classroom that you see for 50 minutes a day or a block schedule, when I taught, block schedules weren't a thing yet and where I was. So I had 175 students, 30 something per period, 6 periods a day. I saw them for 55 minutes a day. I saw 175 high school students every single day in groups of like 35-ish for 55 minutes. There was no way I could know them all.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I couldn't know them. I couldn't serve them optimally. I did the best I could, like you were describing.
Mm-hmm.
I tried, but yeah. So knowing ourselves is
when
so
we
important.
describe that to non-educators, because that I think is a pretty typical high school teacher experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just because that's the way it's been that people don't look at that critically to say, well, what would you do with 35 kids, 55 minutes, 5 different groups of kids every day to be able to really engage them in meaningful ways? And that's an example of the systemic way in which we think education has to be, but it rarely works for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not a joyful way to teach. I mean, frankly, beyond not even getting to know the kids. Fortunately, most of my teaching career, I taught in core, which meant that I had kids for a longer period of time. The head count by the end of the day was the same, but I got to have smaller groups for longer. I mean, same size group, but for longer periods of the day. Right. So I had the same 32 kids for an hour and a half rather than 2 sets of 32 in that same time period. But one year I taught more like a traditional high school setting where I taught 5 sections of the same course during the day, which is what a lot of high school teachers have to do. Or maybe they teach 2 different things and you can't keep track. I mean, like you cannot keep track of what you're teaching because, you're repeating yourself all day. You feel like you've said it 100 times already and you kind of have. It's really hard to keep track of what you've taught, what the nuances were in each class, especially since you only have like a 5-minute passing period. And perhaps you might actually have to go to the bathroom or take care of yourself in some way during that passing period. And so you can't take notes of like where you were at. And like, it's just very hard to track it. So it's just not a very joyful way to teach. I'm aware that we haven't got or learn. I'm aware we haven't gotten to conscious parenting yet. I know we have another quick break here, but maybe we come back. It would be great to hear. I'm curious how you're coaching parents and what it's about. And then also, what do we do around parents that maybe the public school isn't an option for them, but they don't have the means for something different. So I just would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. So we'll be back in just a moment. We'll see which order we come back in. It's very exciting.
Oh, we came back in the same order.
Order.
I figured it out. It's actually how
you bring us back in. I figured that might have been it.
But I can move that around. Anyway, you want to bring us back, cool. Megan?
I'll bring us back. So welcome back, everyone. We're talking with Lauren Keck, who is she does conscious parenting coaching. And when we went on break, we said we'd come back and talk about what does actually coaching or unconscious parenting look like? And how do we support parents to identify their, what they need for their child and identify that, especially when they might not have the means for a private education, which is something that I feel like comes up quite a bit. This isn't working for my kid, but I don't have another option that I'm aware of. So what is conscious parenting specifically, and how do you coach around that? Maybe it's a good starting point.
Yeah, conscious parenting is all about the parents awakening. So like the awakening educator, the awakening parents, conscious parents, awakening to their conditioning, their preferences, who they are. So they have a conscious relationship with these parts of themselves that we're often not taught or supported in becoming consciously in relationship with these parts of ourselves. And then when we're parenting our children, we're kind of functioning on autopilot on whatever we're unconscious about. So try to concretize that a little bit more. Like I might have, a parent come to me with an issue they're having with their child. And oftentimes the original starting point is the parents are like, how do I get my child to do X, Y, and Z? Or how do I change this? And the conscious parenting approach is to go, well, let's pause for a second. Okay, I see what you want and that's not working. Why do you want that? Is that what you really want? Or were you taught you were supposed to want that? You know, we have all these supposed to's around parenting that were handed to us. And we get to discern, well, is this really authentic for me? Is this what I really want for my child? Or am I panicking and reacting to the fear that I'm a bad parent if I don't XYZ? So now I feel like it's being imposed on me, and now I'm imposing it on my child, and it's not a match for the child. So the child's resisting. We talk about how children will respond to us with either compliance or defiance if we're trying to control them and impose things on them. If we get clear and connected to ourselves and conscious, and then we're able to facilitate a connection with our child, seeing who they are, what they need, we can come up with creative solutions to problems that we wouldn't have thought of before if we didn't kind of excavate all of those layers. So hopefully that gives kind of an idea of what, so the coaching sessions are around that excavation process and that getting clear with the parent, and then also changing how we interact with our children.
So it's really interesting. The first thing that came up as a parent of a 15-year-old girl, right? Who we are having lots of discussions around appropriate dress and the culture of, you know, and she's bringing to me, you're giving into rape culture and I should be able to celebrate my body. And I appreciate that. And I'm having trouble seeing how much of her body she's showing, and sort of, and definitely there's a piece of it of like, as a mother, when I'm walking down the street with her, people are like, why do you let her wear that? That is a thought that comes to my mind pretty consistently. And then I'm trying to disentangle the difference between, well, am I having trouble with this because of how people are seeing me as a parent who allows her to dress this way? Or am I having trouble with this because I'm concerned about her safety and how her body's being objectified? And is her body being objectified, or is she owning body positivity? And like all of these complex things as a parent play into it all the time, because and as I become more internally discomfort, he takes it up a notch and shows more of her skin. And I know that as a mental health person, as a therapist who's worked with teenagers my whole career, but it's still this complexity. And I'm still not sure where I fall on it, but it sounds like that's kind of a piece of what you're talking about, is this like distangling,
right?
How much of this is me? How much of this is my job as an adult to provide safety and support for her in the world? And how much of it is her expressing her individuality and personal, like, confidence? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's a beautiful example, because, you know, if I were working with you and or your daughter, I would do exactly what you described. I would help you disentangle and get clear on like what percentage of your discomfort is worry about people thinking you're a bad mother if you let your daughter dress that way. And then what percentage of it is your authentic concerns, feelings, preferences even. And we would get clear on all of that. And then we would also try to help your daughter get the opportunity to evaluate all those pieces for herself. How much of this is her authentic expression? How much of it is her trying to fight for her autonomy? So the more concerned you become, the more skin she shows to prove that she's free, you know, because and it's interesting to just think about developmental phases and power struggles and how we differentiate ourselves and all of those things. And it's making me think too about I appreciate and honor and reflect back to both of you that you have chosen to stay in public education. And I am being categorized in this conversation, and it's accurate, but I'm being categorized as having chosen to leave. And this in-out mentality is something else I want to kind of push back on, because I didn't leave education.
No.
I am learning. I don't like to say I'm teaching, because teaching for me evokes that top down. So I'm learning and I'm sometimes I'm guiding and sometimes I'm doing lots of things. But what happens inside of public education ideally is also happening outside of it, and vice versa. Like, it's not this isolated vacuum where this happens in here. And even private schools too. I have experience in both public and private. There's a lot of similarities between certain public and private schools. There's differences, there's misconceptions, there's myths that people tend to believe somewhat, universally. Private school is this, public school is this. It really depends on the specific school.
Yeah.
And so It's just, fascinating to me to kind of identify all of that. And a developmental phase that I've experienced, and this applies to a lot of things in my life, so I was born into a certain environment. I was traditionally schooled. I became a traditional teacher. And then when I started challenging and rebelling and having kind of my adolescent rebellious phase against what I had been handed that was not serving me, I abandoned it. I rejected it. I went to an opposite extreme. My children and I spent a little bit of time as radical unschoolers, which would be another interesting conversation to have. And because that's kind of swinging the pendulum to the opposite side, like this is now I'm rejecting that. I'm going over here, and then it's been a journey from there, from that adolescent, rebellious, anti whatever you're telling me to do, to like a mature, authentic, discerning, what is right for me? What is right for each of my individual children? What do they need in this moment? And so that's kind of what I would recommend and advocate for all teachers, all schools, all students, all parents, all children.
Yeah, the reflection and the asking, what do I need? And I think part of it though also is, and it came up with what you were describing in a little bit of the story that Susan was telling, which is learning to trust that what you need is okay. Because I think part of what you are rebelling against, and I think is one of our challenges I know is one of our challenges in this country, is there are a lot of cultural norms and expectations that actually don't fit people, that are actually quite constraining. They are certainly like evidence of white supremacy and how that doesn't necessarily fit with others, but also even your kind of non-schooler, I like that word.
Radical unschoolers.
Radical unschoolers.
Yeah.
Like
that's the whole philosophy around education.
Oh yeah. Well, and it was created in reaction against school, and it's inherent in the name, unschool, not school, opposite of that, And so.
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting, right? Because I think and it's one of the worries I have, and I'm just wondering from your perspective, because we have an education system that perpetuates the systems of inequities that we have in this country. We have a lot of people in this country that don't have the confidence, perspective, or appropriate training to have that level of discernment sometimes for their kids, or at least not to feel like they can trust it. I think every parent knows what they want for their kids. So I don't want to say that no parent, like any parent, doesn't have that discernment, but sometimes that discernment isn't respected or seen or doesn't fit well. And it can be difficult if someone had a difficult experience in school, to have the confidence to make a different choice, because they just don't have the grounding in what it is that they're even fighting against, perhaps, or wanting to be different, or even knowing what the options are, which I think is often one of our challenges. Is that it's hard to know what else is out there and what opportunities are there, and then to know what the right one is for our kids. And we worry so much about that because we're parents, and I wonder about how we, I think we need to transform our education system. I think it needs to be one that's much more flexible, that has a lot more range of options for students, and really hold students at the center. I think we need to create spaces that are welcome and nourishing and supportive for educators, part of which means treating them like professionals. Yeah. So not treating them like automatons that come in and teach something from the book. And we have to have systems. I'm a systems person, so I have a lot of dynamic, and we need to have systems. I just had the conversation today with someone around, we actually can't, in public education, the way it's structured right now, have every person doing whatever they want. We can't do that, because that's actually not manageable from a systems level. Our system can't handle that. So we have all of these, it's challenging. So it's exciting to hear that there's someone like you out there that's helping parents to understand what their options are right now. But I'm wondering how we start to bring that forward to other parents, or if you have thoughts about how to start to share the options that are available now, and how we advocate if people are interested in it. If one wants to advocate for changes, what are some places to start to do that?
To help parents that aren't aware of their options for their children in education become more aware.
Yeah.
When I was in the Indianapolis area, there were a lot of charter schools that would advertise and try to make parents aware of these different options that were in the area that were part of the public school system. So they were accessible in the sense that they were not private. They did not have tuition. They were public charter schools. They did have a lottery system. So if parents were interested in that school for their child, they would, participate in the lottery and hope their number was chosen. And, so
I'd like to bring in, I'd like to bring into the conversation, having read Cutting Education recently, and to even take that to the next level of systems. And I think both, as you were talking, that was coming up for me around charter schools advertising to low income communities and the exploitation that many of these large corporate backed charter schools have capitalized on low income Black and brown children whose families are really desperate for a better education that works for their children, who have been advertised these systems these schools that are supposedly better, are going to give them something different, and many oftentimes don't live up to that piece. And so I just think that we have this complex system of money, public education, charter schools, corporate exploitation of low income communities that has really made it difficult for a lot of families to be able to discern, is this something that's best for my child? And then to take it to the sort of next level is this something that is then ultimately depleting our overall educational system for our children? And I'm not an anti-charter, but I'm also not a blindly supporting of charter. My son goes to a charter school. So I just think we need to be having a more nuanced conversation about who's advertising, who's benefiting, and are we really providing the education that kids deserve? And how are we? And back to Megan's question about, we do need to have the systems to be able to, it doesn't have to all look the same. And this top-down standardized way of like teaching to the test doesn't work. But we do need to have some ways of evaluating what do the kids need and how are we responding to that? And how do we know if, like, I think you said at the very beginning, how do we know that we're meeting the goals that we have as parents and educators for our children? How do we know that what they're getting is what they deserve or what they need? So,
right. And I think really what I would most want to tell parents is to look at their children, look at who their children are, and then try to find something that's a match for that child. And whether it's a charter school, whether it's the regular public school, because that child happens to be a match for that, whether it's a private school, whether it's homeschooling, if they have the option to do that, unschooling, there's hack schooling, there's all kinds of things developing now. I mean, there's such a variety of movements and things happening. And I'm very aware of the barriers to a lot of these things, not just charter schools that have a lottery system that sometimes don't even live up to the expectations, but also, the financial barriers to homeschooling or unschooling, because there's some false assumptions and then there's also some realities, because people will say, well, very few people can afford to be a one-income family with two parents. So one parent takes on the role of educating the children, whether they're homeschooling or unschooling or doing Montessori at home, which I did for a little while too. And all of those concerns are true. Most families either need to be two income or they only have one adult. And so if you only have one adult, then you really have a different set of issues. If you have two, but they both have to work, or, you have all these issues. And there are lots of ways that people are making things work creatively. I mean, I know families where both parents work and they're still managing to homeschool their children in a way that works. And it's a, non-traditional schedule when they're doing the teaching and things like that. And it just all kinds of variety, even single parents. I mean, my sister's a single mom who has chosen an alternate path for her children and she homeschools them. And so there's lots of variety out there. And I think as regular public schools lose tax money because they have less students, and they ask themselves, what can we do about this? Because in the same way that charter schools prey upon Black and brown students of low income and also, other white students of low income, even like a variety of low income students. And their only option is either the regular public school or the charter school because they can't afford tuition. Even the regular public schools are preying on all of us. They're preying on everyone because they're like, this is your option unless you pay tuition somewhere else, or maybe you have multiple choices within that public school system. And the public school systems were not designed to prioritize the customers necessarily, and so like the feedback they're getting from people who have the means and the ability to make other choices, and that lowers their head count, which is supposed to lower how much money they get. That's something that they could really take into account and see how they could create something different that's going to authentically attract more people, because I think that's an opportunity for growth, or they can double down on what they've, been doing. And so.
Yes. This is such a, we're actually already at time, and this is such a fascinating conversation. And I really appreciate your perspective on, that I do think we're in a turning point in education.
Absolutely.
I do believe that. I think the pandemic has made people aware of a lot of things, the challenges of education, also the amazing things that education systems do. A lot of people didn't realize that our schools feed our children, watch our children. There's a lot of debates right now around like how we're going to get mental health supports to our kids through school. So schools provide a lot. And the system hasn't changed much in the last almost 200 years. So, so it needs to change. And I think because families are starting to vote with their feet, and they created something different last year. So these pod schools and alternate schools that people created are creating something new, and are pushing the system a little bit. I'm hoping that we can.
I'd add to that educators too, right? Like educators have also walked with their feet traditionally and are also seeing that there's other opportunities and that they don't have to sacrifice their whole life and sacrifice their mental well-being to do this. And I think that that's another.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Yeah, I totally agree. I think educators are also demonstrating. We've tried something different, and you can't put things back in the box again once it's out. So it's out. We're out of the box around some of these things. Anyway, this is my long diatribe of saying thank you for coming in. How can people learn more about you and what you're doing?
My website is sunshowercoaching.com. So you can find me there. And I'm also co-hosting a podcast called Soul Path Parenting, which you can find wherever podcasts are. So those are two ways.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for joining with us today. It was such a fun conversation. I feel like we could talk for another hour.
Yeah, very rich. A lot of alignment.
Yeah, really cool. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Susan, thanks for always being you. You're so awesome too.
Thank you, Megan. You're awesome too. Really so happy to co-host.
Awesome.
All right, I'm going to end the broadcast. All right. Oh, what is that? What? There.
We're still live.
It gave me I know.